Are you crazy? You want to learn Mandarin Chinese? It's the most difficult language in the world. These were the exact words my aunt told me when I said I was starting Chinese. And honestly, I got a similar reaction from other people when I decided to learn Hungarian, and then again with Polish. It seems like everyone has an opinion on which language is the Mount Everest of learning. But what if I told you that they're all wrong? What if the very idea of a difficult language is a myth that is holding you back? My name is Luca Lampadiello, and after learning languages that people call easy and languages people call hard, I can tell you that difficulty is an illusion. My friend Till Musov made an excellent video breaking this down, and today we're going to react to it to uncover the truth. We'll dismantle this myth and give you a new framework for thinking about languages that will make you a more effective learner, no matter what you choose. And if you want to get started, I've created a free guide about how to choose your next language and actually learn it. The link is in the pinned comment below. Let's get into it, lovely people.
Mandarin with its thousands of characters, or Arabic because of its complex writing system and difficult pronunciation, or maybe Hungarian with its 18 different cases. Which language deserves the title of most difficult to learn? What even makes a language difficult? A language that's incredibly challenging for one person might be relatively straightforward for another. Japanese is often called one of the hardest languages to learn for English speakers, but for Korean speakers, not so much. And while Mandarin with its different tones and characters might drive an English speaker crazy, its grammar is actually much simpler than English. In this video we look at some fascinating features of different languages, and we will figure out which one is the hardest to learn. That is, if such a thing exists.
That's a very good point. And this reminds me of the first time when I decided to learn Mandarin Chinese. I remember my aunt told me, "Are you crazy? Chinese is the most difficult language in the world." And you hear it often also from Paul saying that Polish is the most difficult language in the world, that Hungarian, you hear from Hungarians that Hungarian is the most difficult language in Europe or the world, etc., etc. And this is a very interesting topic because actually the most difficult language of the world, as Till here will demonstrate, is kind of a relative concept. So let's get into it.
Let's start by understanding why this question is more complex than it might seem. First of all, we need to be clear what we are talking about. We are not discussing constructed languages like Izquil or languages spoken by only a handful of people. We're looking at popular languages you might actually want to learn. The difficulty of a language comes down to several factors. In this video, we will consider the following. Writing systems. How many characters do you need to learn? How complex are they? Sound systems. From tones to throat sounds to pitch accent. Everything that has to do with pronunciation. Grammar features, cases, conjugations, and other structural complexities. And finally, practical factors, available resources and exposure opportunities. We started at
I really like this breakdown because language learning is more or less difficult or more or less easy or easier because it fundamentally depends on the distance between your own native language or languages you already have under your belt and the target language or the target languages. And this distance is made of multiple parts, and I think Till broke it down perfectly here. These are the main things. There's more to it than meets the eye, as I say, but these are the fundamental, let's say, features of each language that define whether a language is going to be more or less difficult.
Top with writing systems. Mandarin Chinese is often considered difficult because of its thousands of characters. But here's the thing, unless you're planning to become a calligrapher, you don't need to learn how to write these by hand. Reading is what matters, and with digital tools, that's become much more manageable.
It's a very important point to make. This kind of reminds me of the first time that I tackled Mandarin Chinese. And I remember that the first question was, should I learn characters? Because I was worried that if I didn't learn characters, I would not be able to read. Now, the thing is, you can read, you have to recognize characters, but you do not need to write them by hand. My friend and colleague Luca Toma is a calligrapher, he's a shodo master, and he's been spending a lot of time on perfecting the art of writing by hand, both for Japanese and for Mandarin Chinese. But the reality is, you don't need that. And that also reminds me of when I had a date with a Japanese girl. I still remember it to this day. We're sitting at this bar, we're having fun, and then all of a sudden I was asking her if she could write by hand some characters, and I said something. I asked her for a specific word or expression, I don't remember exactly, and she couldn't write it for the life of her. and she had to look it up. And this goes to show that even native speakers do not know how to handwrite certain things that are maybe a little bit too complex, and they're relying more and more on digital devices. And also in our Western world, fewer and fewer people tend to write by hand. I stand by the fact that writing by hand is really important for a number of things, but unfortunately the trend is not goes in the direction of not writing by hand. But when it comes to Mandarin Chinese and Japanese, you do not need to write by hand. If you want to, you have to know it's going to take a long, long time.
That being said, it's still a boatload of work to memorize how these characters look and what they mean. Japanese even takes this one step further, at least in theory. It has not one, not two, but three writing systems. Luckily, two of them are very easy to learn, and only kanji, which are basically imported Chinese characters, are a challenge. What makes this even trickier though is that even if you think you know what a kanji means, you don't necessarily really know what it means in which context or how to read it and pronounce it in the first place. Because they can have different readings depending on context. That's why I'm only learning vocabulary and not kanji in isolation.
This is a very, very important point that goes for both Mandarin Chinese and Japanese. To me, language learning is a complex thing that is learned in a simple way. And the simple way is to get exposed to the content as much as you can, both in listening and reading. If you listen and read at the same time, then you will acquire the language naturally. Your brain will develop a sound map between how the language is spoken and how the language is written. This was particularly true when I started learning Mandarin Chinese and then Japanese. If you read and listen at the same time, your mind will pick up the sounds, and they will see the differences in context. And it's also important to stress that if you download a keyboard, a virtual keyboard, then you can start typing directly by using Latin letters and Roman letters or Latin letters, the Latin alphabet. And then the system will give you some choices, because especially in Mandarin Chinese, but also in Japanese, depending on what you write, it will give you this or that solution, because once again, especially for Mandarin Chinese, you have a lot of homophones, meaning that they sound the same, but they're written in a completely different way and they mean different things. So once again, expose yourself to the language and then start typing rather than handwriting. Now, I'm not suggesting you should avoid handwriting by all means. If you want to, go for it, but you have to know that if you want to focus on getting the language in you and use it as fast as you can, handwriting is actually going to slow you down.
Arabic presents a different kind of challenge with its writing system. There are only 28 letters, which sounds easy enough. But unfortunately, the letters change form depending on their position in the word, making it difficult to recognize them at first. And to make things even more interesting, they usually drop the short vowel sounds in written text. This means you often need to figure out how to read a word from context. For example, the three consonants KTB could be read this way, or this, or this, or like 100 other options. So again, you need to know the word from context to know how to pronounce it.
That's actually true. And once again, it looks daunting, especially Arabic, but also Chinese and Japanese. But if you read and listen at the same time, then your brain is going to pick these things up naturally in a simple way, rather than wrecking your brains to figure things out and writing them and trying to memorize it. It's just expose yourself to the content, especially listening and then listening and reading and then listening again, and you will see the magic happen, meaning that your brain is powerful enough to pick these things up very naturally. I always say that language learning, especially language acquisition, is setting up the table and finding the right food and chewing it slowly so that then the rest of the body can digest the information. If you set up a crappy table, pardon my French, and then with the food is not great, and then you chew it fast, then you risk not digesting it well.
As a nice little bonus, you're writing from right to left. So to summarize this section, I guess we're really lucky with our writing system in English. Or are we? English writing is actually really hard. We are just so used to it. The relationship between spelling and pronunciation is, well, weird to say the least. Why do though, through, and cuff all end in O-U-G-H but sound completely different? Why is the S in island silent? Where did the K in knife, night, and no go? Why is it height but also weight? Why is this read and at the same time read? English spelling is a wild ride because these inconsistencies are absolutely everywhere. So English is a very difficult language to write for non-native speakers.
It's really interesting that English has this nightmarish spelling. And to even further prove the point, I just found here a famous poem, which is called The Chaos. I'm just going to read the first verse. You probably know about it. Dearest creature in creation, study English pronunciation. I will teach you in my verse. Corpse, core, horse, and worse. As you can see, I pronounce certain words or certain combinations of words in the same way, but they're written in a completely different way, which makes English difficult. But that's not the only difficulty of English, because the written language is a rough representation of the spoken language, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit. But it's important to stress that every language has its own difficulties. For example, English has, yes, indeed, a Latin alphabet. You can read it easily, but it's not as easy as it looks, because from the perspective of an Italian or a French person or a Spanish person, for that matter, actually, the spoken language is very different from the way the language works in writing. And this gets even more difficult with other features that every single language has.
Language to write for non-native speakers. But writing systems are just one small piece of the puzzle of what's the most difficult language to learn. Let's look at one factor that might be even more difficult for some, which is tones, or rather sound systems. When it comes to sound systems, tonal languages like Mandarin Chinese or Vietnamese often get mentioned first. In these languages, the syllable can have completely different meanings depending on the tone you use.
You can see here, for example, you have the ma, 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 ma. And these are three different pitches. So the pitch of your voice is different. The frequency at which your vocal cords vibrate are different, and they mean four different things for four different syllables. And this is a feature of tonal languages, something that European languages and many other languages do not have.
Mandarin has 4 of these tones and Vietnamese has 6 even.
Bo, bò, bỏ, 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 bỏ.
Raise their hands those who heard the same sound over and over.
Many people think these different tones are unique to Asian languages. But once again, English has its own little quirks and difficulties here. Think about how the word really can mean completely different things depending on how you pronounce it. Really expresses genuine curiosity or surprise. Really is a confirmation or agreement. Really shows skepticism or sarcasm. Then there are sounds that some languages have that others completely lack. Arabic is famous for its throat sounds.
Before we move on and talk about the sounds in other languages, I wanted to stress that there's a fundamental difference between tones on the one hand and pitch contours. So, for example, Till was talking about the fact that you can say really, really in various tones, but that's more like the pitch contour that has to do with intonation, while tones are more about the lexical level, at a word level, right? So, for example, you take one word, and that word, whether it has one syllable or two syllables, has different tones. And that word means different things depending on the tones. But pitch contours are slightly different. Pitch contours have to do with intonation. And once again, changing the pitch contour of a sentence can change its meaning, or it can even change the emotion that you want to convey. So for example, let's consider a sentence like, I didn't steal the money. If you see it written, you would pronounce it, for example, you would utter the sentence, I didn't steal the money. That would be the standard, right? The intonation falls on money. So you stress money. That's the object you didn't steal, right? I didn't steal the money. But then you can also say, I didn't steal the money. And so you can stress I, which means I didn't do it, someone else did it. Or I didn't steal the money. Maybe you burned it. You did something else with it. So you can stress, for example, the subject, the verb, or even the object. And if you see it in writing, that's always the same sentence. But also on top of that, you can also change the tone or the intonation in another sense. For example, I can say, I didn't steal the money. I didn't steal the money. You're angry. So in one case, you're depressed. In the other case, you are angry. So here you have to consider that you can change the stress. That's also part of intonation, pitch contour, but you can also change the tone, the volume, etc., etc. And by modulating all these features, you can change the meaning, you can change the emotion within a given set of words. This is how amazing sound structure of English and other languages actually is.
It can be particularly challenging for English speakers.
Ayn. Ayn is pronounced from the middle of the throat. Ghain. Ghain is pronounced.
Ghain. Let me try it. Ein. I'm not sure if I pronounce it well. I don't speak Arabic, but ayn comes from the middle of the throat.
From the highest part of the throat.
Though as a German speaker, I at least have a little bit of an advantage here, as these throat sounds are at least somewhat similar to the ones we already have in German. Japanese pronunciation is fairly consistent and not that hard, but its pitch accent system and blazingly fast speech rate can make it really hard to follow and copy. German pronunciation is also somewhat difficult, but that's not really.
Before we talk about German pronunciation, I just wanted to stress that pitch accent is a very key feature of Japanese. Just to give an example for those who don't speak Japanese, you have a pitch. So for example, you say ha-shi, ha-shi. So you can tell that the first syllable ha is higher than shi. This means chopsticks. Ha-shi, ha-shi. But then you have ha-shi, which means bridge. So you can see that the configuration of the pitch is completely different. The first one is high-low. The second one is low-high, right? Ha-shi, ha-shi. And then things get complicated because Japanese also adds particles. For example, ga, wa, to introduce a subject. Let's say ga. So you can have ha-shi, ga, ha-shi, ga, ha-shi, ga, which are three different things, actually. I think the last one is edge. So depending on the configuration, you not only have different configurations of the pitch accent within words, but then you have to embed them in sentences. And depending on what you say, the pitch configuration of the word in isolation changes within a given context. That's what makes pitch accent so cool and so difficult to actually nail for foreigners.
Really because of individual sounds, but more because some German words are long and we love to stack consonants, like in Angstschweiß, Schlittschuhläufe, Eichhörnchen, or Rechtsschutzversicherungsgesellschaften.
Don't get terrified by these words. It's important to know that when you have a word, it's important, whether you have a very long word or you have a short word, remember that you can always break it down into its simple components. That really helps you not only pronounce it better, but also to remember it better. In this case, recht is right? So you have recht, this S is always there. That, you know, it helps in German to put things together, compound words. Recht, then you have Schutz, so Rechtsschutz, and then Versicherung, then you have this, once again, this S here, Gesellschaften. So this is indeed a very long word. You don't need to use it anyway, but really the concept is you can break words down into its single components. It will help you hugely, not only to pronounce them, but also to remember them. And for shorter words, it's really important to you to learn how to break these words down into syllables, because once again, it helps you pronounce them much better.
So we looked at writing, we looked at pronunciation. Let's look at another factor that might really drive you crazy, and that is grammar, or rather its inconsistencies. Hungarian, for example, has 18 different cases. For comparison, English has basically 0, German has 4, and Russian has 6. And just when you think you've got them all memorized, you discover that Hungarian also loves to stack suffixes on suffixes through agglutination. That's a lot of crazy lingo, so let me explain what that means. Take this word, which means house.
This is pronounced has. It's this accent makes the vowel more open, has.
You can add suffixes for possession, location, numbers, and more, all to the same word. So this one means in my houses.
Hazaimban.
And you can keep going. This one would mean in
Hazaimbanként.
each of my houses. That looks fun.
But here's the thing. If you say that Hungarian has cases, it actually makes it much more difficult than it actually is, because it's true, for example, that, say, German has 4 cases and Russian has 6 cases, sometimes 7 with a vocative. But the reality is that Hungarian works in a slightly different way, because it takes, you know, these suffixes and then adds them to the root of the word. And that is a little bit of a different concept than cases. And so you say, okay, 18 cases, oh my God, this is going to be so difficult. But if you actually understand the logic behind it, it's not as difficult. Imagine that in English, we have car, in the car, on the car, of the car, blah, blah, blah. But in Hungarian, it's just car of the, or car in the. You just put the suffixes, you just put of the later, and you attach it directly to the root of the word or the word itself. So it's a different way of doing things, but at the same time, it's not as difficult as it looks. So sometimes when you hear that someone says, oh, Hungarian has 26 cases, Finnish has 56 cases, etc., you have to understand that things in practice can be actually easier or less daunting than you can imagine.
At least Hungarian is consistent with its rules. Arabic, on the other hand, takes grammar complexity to the next level.
Yeah, this is another very important point. Hungarian and Turkish, they're very similar in this regard. Once you understand the logic, it's way easier to pile up, to understand and then remember word after word, because if you understand the logic behind it, the basic logic behind how words are constructed and how words work also within sentences, is way easier. It's way easier to develop the language itself and to speak it, remember words, etc., etc.
Not only does it have complex verb conjugations that change based on person, number, gender, tense, and mood, but the root system means that most words are built from 3 consonant roots that can transform into dozens of related words. Plus, it has both gender systems and cases. It's like they looked at every possible grammatical feature and said, yes, we'll take them all.
I think Arabic is a fascinating language. I will learn it one day.
Japanese grammar too is very difficult for English speakers to learn, not because it is complex per se, but because it's just so different from what we are used to.
That's absolutely true. When I started learning Japanese, that was my nightmare. The fact that it was the first time that I was tackling an SOV language, subject, verb, object, verb. So you put the verb at the end. And not only that, like Japanese has a completely different way of forming sentences, forming and conveying meaning. And at the very beginning, I tried to utter very long and complicated sentences, and that led to disaster. I was constantly thinking about which word I should use here and that word, and then I had to arrange them, in a completely different order. It goes without saying, it was really difficult to communicate. I was having these first conversations with a tutor, and I was very discouraged because I did not think it would be so difficult. So syntax is one of the most difficult, let's say, aspects of a foreign language. And it's funny and fun. It's interesting that Turks learn Japanese, very easily, or let's say more easily than, say, Italians, Spaniards, the French, because the syntax is very, very similar to the syntax in Japanese. So Japanese and Turkish have a very similar syntax, and the same goes for Korean. So Korean, Japanese, Turkish are SOV languages. They all share a very similar way of conveying information. That is why it's a huge load off for Japanese to learn Turkish or for Turks to learn Japanese, but not for me, unfortunately.
Mandarin grammar, on the other hand, is actually quite simple. No conjugations, no gender, no plural forms. Instead of changing the verb to different tenses like we do in English, for example, or even more so in languages like French, Spanish, Portuguese, Mandarin just adds time indicating words like yesterday or tomorrow, and the verb stays exactly the same.
That is the reason why I think that Mandarin Chinese was, in my book, way easier to learn than Japanese. Because in Chinese, you don't have to think about syntax that much. You don't have to think about conjugating verbs, etc., etc. You just have to say a sentence which is very similar, has a very similar structure to the one you would say in Italian, English, French, Spanish, a lot of European languages. So that is a huge load off your working memory. And of course, you have to worry about tones, but tones is just a minor thing compared to having to think about the whole structure of the language and having to say a complex concept, having to convey a complicated concept in a completely different way.
Want to make something plural? Just add a number or many before it. And with just a handful of particles, Mandarin handles what other languages need complex grammar for. Japanese, by the way, has these particles too. Instead of a handful, there are 188. They all give words different meanings and functions.
Yeah, you can say here, ga no ni. I used it before when I say hashiga or hashiga, etc., etc. It's just when you're introducing a subject. Actually, when introducing a theme, it's wa. When introducing a subject within that theme, is ga. But it gives you an idea of the fact that when you say whatever, you have to also use the article. You also have to use the particle so that you're specifying the specific function of that element within the sentence.
That's clearly not difficult enough. There's this whole dropping words thing where essential parts of the sentence are just gone. It's like every conversation is a guessing game where you need to fill out the blanks of what the other person really wants to say.
Back in the day when I was attending this conference interpreting in Paris, I remember that the interpreters that were working for Japanese, they had a really hard time. This also happened for German, but particularly for Japanese, because in Japanese, the sentence structure, as we said, is completely different. So In any European language, you start with the subject and you already know more or less where the sentence is going. But for Japanese, you will discover this at the very end. So Japanese conference interpreters have to wait until the sentence has been uttered so that they can reconstruct the meaning. And that is very, very difficult because in the meanwhile, the speaker continues. So that adds a layer of complexity to the already complicated art of interpreting into another language.
This brings up an interesting point. Things you are not used to are naturally more difficult. English speakers often find Spanish or French easier to learn, not because they're objectively simpler languages, but because they share so many features with English. English is a Germanic language, but at the same time it's kind of not, because most of its words come from Latin and French, which are both Romance languages. So learning other Romance languages isn't that difficult. Meanwhile, English has plenty of complexities that drive non-natives absolutely crazy. Like its different tenses or those phrasal verbs where adding a preposition completely changes the meaning. Or when you can put any word in front of shit to create new meanings. Dog shit is terrible, bullshit are lies, horse shit is complete nonsense, and bad shit is crazy, of course.
This reminds me of a Finnish stand-up comedian. I don't remember exactly the name. I will put a link in the description box to one of his videos where he talks about the S word, the shit. And he says that English is so strange because you can say he's the shit, but if you say he's a shit, it's a completely different. And you have, 40 or 50 expressions revolving around this nice word. And it really doesn't make any sense to a non-native speaker. Why do you use this word in this way? And it really says a lot about some illogical parts of the English language, at least from the perspective of other languages such as Italian or Spanish. And it's a fascinating feature of English because a lot of people say that English is an easy language, but I don't think English is that easy. There are things that are easy, like the conjugation of verbs, because verbs, for example, do not change. Well, yeah, you put the S sometimes, but let's say that the conjugation of verbs is relatively straightforward in comparison with other languages, but then you have a deluge of other features really makes English a complicated language to acquire, at least at a very high level.
A non-English speaker, this probably seems as arbitrary as the particles in Japanese do to English speakers. But beyond all these linguistic features, there are some very practical factors that determine how difficult a language is to learn. The most obvious one is resource availability. English is arguably the easiest language to learn. And that is not because English is easy, it's just because English is everywhere. Movies, music, websites, apps, even street signs. You're constantly exposed to English whether you want to or not. One of the reasons I built Langia is to solve this content availability problem. Maybe you have your favorite blogs in English but can't find similar content in your target language. Or the content exists but it's way above your level. Langia lets you take any web article, simplify and translate it to your level and thereby make it accessible to you. Plus you get daily stories matched to your interests and level in your target language. Because having engaging material that you can understand is the most important factor no matter what language you're learning.
Yeah, this is a very, very important point. It's really important to consume content that you find interesting, comprehensible, and more or less at your level, maybe slightly higher, so you're constantly stretching your boundaries, so to speak. So this is a very important thing. I've been using Langia for Turkish, and I love it. And this also reminds me of the fact that materials, the availability of materials is really important. People don't talk about this, but how difficult the language is also depends on how much material or native speakers you can find in order to absorb the language. When I started learning Serbian in 2022, the big problem that I had is that there was not a lot of material. AI was in its infancy, or better said, we still didn't have ChatGPT. And what I basically did, I took Asimil, which was for Croatian, and then I asked my friend to basically take that version and create the alternative version for Serbian, or the Serbian version. And then I also asked her to take, for example, BBC 6-Minute English, which is a series of podcasts, 6-minute podcasts, and translate them for me into Serbian and create the audio. So for me, learning Serbian, as far as learning Serbian, the problem was not the language per se, because I already had 2 Slavic languages under my belt, in particular Russian and Polish. It was the dearth of materials.
I actually had a guy in my comments who wanted to learn Korean and he couldn't speak English, but since all the good learning material that he wanted to use for Korean was not available in his native language, he learned English first. So he ended up learning English just to access better Korean learning materials.
This reminds me of myself. I learn a lot of languages through English or French, especially French, because when I started, for example, say Danish or even Turkish, I only found Asimil in French. So the fact that I knew French really helped.
This exposure and availability factor is huge. You might be studying the quote-unquote easiest language in the world, but if you can't find adequate material or a practice partner, you're going to struggle. On the flip side, you might be tackling a, again, quote-unquote difficult language, but if you're passionate about its movies, music or culture, you'll probably make much faster progress. This is why some institutes that categorize languages by difficulty list Arabic, Mandarin, Cantonese, Japanese and Korean as the hardest languages to learn. But they are really just measuring the distance from English and the typical amount of study hours needed. They don't consider your actual native language, your interests or your access to resources.
This is another excellent point. These can give you a framework of reference, that's totally fine, but the reality is when it comes to learning a language and how long it takes and how difficult it is going to be, there are subjective factors, but also objective factors. The subjective factor depends on the learner, how much experience they have, how much time, what are their life circumstances, do they live in that country where the language is spoken, are they very interested in the language itself? And then, of course, we have objective factors such as the distance between the target language and their own native language or languages they have under their belt. So you have to consider a lot of factors. They're not just one factor, but of course things are always much more complicated than they look.
If someone points a gun at my head and I have to tell him one language that is the most difficult to learn for an English speaker, I would choose Arabic. Its writing is hard, its pronunciation is hard, its grammar is hard, and its availability isn't that great either, because dialects are so wildly different to the point where they use completely different vocabulary and even grammar.
Fair enough. For me personally, the most difficult language I've learned is Japanese because of its syntax, because I didn't know how to tackle it, because I thought I would just start speaking as I had done for European languages. And of course, the strategy fell flat on its face. But once again, it really depends on you. You might find some other languages, maybe Japanese, you found it easy, and some other language you found it extremely difficult. So it really depends on the learner and a number of other factors that we've discussed until now.
If I don't have a gun pointed at my head and I can give a more balanced response where I don't need to decide on one specific language, I would first of all say that each language has its difficulties and that there is no most difficult language to learn per se. The most difficult language to learn is the one you're not interested in.
I really like the sentence. The most difficult language is the one you don't feel like learning. At the end of the day, the most important factor is your interest. If you know your why, you will find the how, right? If you really, really want to learn a language, if you're intrinsically motivated, and then once you find a language difficult or not, there's a lot of factors involved, whether you've already have a lot of experience learning languages, whether you're interested, whether you have a chance of using the language, whether you have language learning materials to learn the language, and many other things. And by the way, there's a beautiful book that talks about this, about the difficulty and complexity of languages, which is called Through the Language Glass. I think the author is Deutsch. His name is Deutsch, and he talks about the fact that people tended to think that the civilization or the level of technological level that certain peoples reach was directly dependent on the complexity of the language that they were speaking. So for example, Europeans and European linguists tended to think that European languages were superior in terms of complexity than other tribal languages spoken in, say, South America or Africa, because they thought that their civilization was more developed. But they actually found out that this is not true. And the conclusion that Deutsch reaches in his book is that all languages are equally complex. So complexity has to do with every language per se as a standalone entity, but difficulty is a relative concept of, your own native language or languages that you know versus your target language or languages you want to learn.
Because in the end, what matters isn't how many cases a language has or how complex its writing system is. It's how motivated you are to learn it, how much you enjoy engaging with it, and what resources you have available. You might struggle with easy Spanish if you hate every minute of it, while making steady progress in difficult Japanese, because you genuinely enjoy the culture and resources.
The most important point of this video, in my humble opinion, is that the most important factor in language learning is not the language, it's the learner. A passionate, consistent student of Japanese will always succeed over a lukewarm student of Spanish. That's because the FSI rankings do not really measure difficulty. They measure distance from English. The real question is not what's the hardest language. The real question is my why, my reason for learning strong enough to walk a long path? And is my how, my learning system, effective enough to get me there? Your why and your how will always beat the what. That is the secret. As Nietzsche said it best, if you know your why, you will find your how. And if you're ready to find a language where your why is strong enough to make the journey worth it, do not forget to download my free guide about how to choose your next language. It's designed to help you do just that. Click the pinned comment or the link in the description box to grab it. Thank you so much for watching. If this video changed your perspective on difficulty, you will probably love this other video about the real reason people quit learning. You can find it somewhere here. As always, happy language learning, and I'll see you in the next video.